Hey you guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tacticalbassin. Today we're talking about jig fishing for bass in the fall. We all know the jig is a great technique. It catches big bass. Today I'm going to show you which styles to throw and when to use them. This time of year, we spend most of our time talking about shad, throwing crankbaits and flukes and chasing bait balls, chasing busting fish. But there's a whole other part of the fall that does not get enough attention, and that is bass that are targeting crawfish. Guys in the north, most of those lakes don't have shad at all. We're well aware of that. Guys fishing rivers, guys fishing creeks, crawfish around the country are the main forage, or at least the most consistent forage in those places. Some pond guys, you don't have a lot of those small bait fish, but you've got crawdads. So today we're talking about the jig. Now, the crawdad thing, it's been sprinkled throughout. Even though we were talking to you about throwing crankbaits, you might have noticed when we were at Dale Hollow talking speed cranking, the colors that we got bit on first thing were crawfish imitators. When we did that river drift in the kayaks, where I ran into the big muskie, we were throwing that Megabass Z crank, crawfish colored. So it's been there the entire time, but today we're focused on jigs. And here's why. Sometimes you need to slow down. You just can't go out there and power fish every single day. Even though I try to. That's my favorite way to fish. Sometimes you just have to slow down. And the jig is amazing when you get into that circumstance. Now, sure, you could drop shot, you could throw a Ned rig, you could do all sorts of things. So why do I advocate for a jig? Why should this be important in your bass fishing? The reason is very simple. Jigs, one, they catch fish, but two, more importantly, they have a tendency to catch giant fish. And what I mean by that is that if you're going down the bank slow fishing, somebody on the boat's throwing a drop shot, somebody's throwing a shaky head. If one of you switches over to a jig, if you happen to come by a true monster bass, the odds are so much higher of that fish eating a jig than virtually any other slow presentation. That's why I want it in your arsenal. Now, it's not just a great big jig. Like this Kitech jig, we're going to get to him in a minute. He's tiny. But the odds of getting a monster bite on this compared to some other tiny bait, so much higher. So for jigs, we're keeping it really simple today. We're primarily talking about football jigs, and there's only 3 of them. But to kick it off, I'm going to talk about one other bait. I'm going to start with the guys that still have a lot of grass. And I'm talking to you because this is the only part of the video that's for you. The rest is for everybody else. So if you are on one of these fisheries that still got a lot of vegetation, like here on Chickamauga, I'm looking around behind the camera right now, there's all sorts of grass beds here still. If you come up in that shallow water and try to throw a football jig, it'll be really, really frustrating. But a lot of the country, they don't have that grass problem. They're fishing rock, they're fishing sand, they're fishing mud. Sure, there might be a little bit of grass, but you can fish outside of the grass. But on a true grass fishery, you're better off with a pitchin style head, an arky style head, because it will do everything. You can fish rock, you can fish it around wood, but when you come to grass, you can fish it through the grass. It will do everything really well. 1/2 ounce pitchin jig, 2 colors. This is go-to. The other color is super matte brown. Now this is in a football, but same color. Super matte brown. Today's gonna be really, really simple. If you just had these 2 colors in a pitchin style head, and you're on a southern fishery that's got some grass, this will get you through the entire fall. I pair it up with a beaver. I keep it simple. Take a beaver, cut the first 3 to 4 ribs off of it, thread it on there, and you're done. That's a great jig that will get you through the entire fall. Now, that's out of the way. Let's talk football jigs. Why should you be throwing a football jig? Where do you throw it? Let's start with the where, because this is really neat. Even if your fishery had a bunch of grass, because a lot of lakes will have some summertime grass, but it dies back pretty quick going into fall. Even if your fishery had grass, once it starts to die back, bass become so predictable. You know where the big bass live. And if you don't, I'm about to tell you. In your fishery, as the water temperatures drop in the fall, and it's not a specific temperature. Once your nighttime temps start to drop, your water temperatures will start to follow. That water temperature is different in the south than the north. But for both of them, when they start to fall, bass go into that fall time pattern. As that temperature continues to drop, vegetation dies, the bass pull to hard structure. What does that mean? That means that if you had a giant grass bed and now it's gone, and there was a tree stump out there in the middle of it, they're on the tree stump. It means that if you look at your shoreline and there are laid down trees coming down and there's nothing else, that's where your bass are. It means that if your lake is muddy, it's got long tapering points, muddy points, steep walls, doesn't matter. And then some of those points are rockier. They've got deep water access, the hard structure, the rock. That's where your bass are. Because it's that easy to predict to them, you can slow down, you can fish slower with a jig and be really, really effective. And again, we just know from decades of bass fishing that giant bass are attracted to a jig. They love to eat crawdads. Just in general, bass love to ambush and eat crawdads. But the jig underwater, it puffs up, it creates this great profile. When this thing's in the water, it doesn't look like this. It poofs up, and there's a trailer in there. It's a large profile to that bass. It's worth eating. It's a big meal. Plus, if they come up close to inspect it, that skirt will move. Anytime the water moves, as a bass comes in, it pushes a wall of water. That skirt will just sit there and move. It's secondary action. Much like with swim baits, we're always talking about trying to find a way to have secondary action. The jig has it built in. Secondary action really helps to fool big fish. That's that thing that takes an inanimate object, a jig laying on the bottom, and you start getting all this movement out of it, and all of a sudden it looks like the real thing, and they go for it. So 3 jigs for 3 different circumstances. We're keeping it that simple, just a couple of trailers. Today's not super in-depth. This is just about helping you get out on the water this fall and stick fish consistently. And if you come across a big one, get that big one too. So the first one, this is a Bass Patrol jig. It's a round rubber jig with a little bit of silicone in it to give it a color accent. That's all that jig is. If you are a guy on a budget, the Bass Patrol jig should be your best friend. We have thrown these since, I don't know how long I've thrown them, 10 or 15 years I've thrown a Bass Patrol jig. In the West, we throw them in the reservoirs. Those reservoirs have steep canyon walls, clear water, and that Bass Patrol is a very thin profile. The round rubber moves very, very well in the cold. They just consistently get bit. A Bass Patrol jig paired up with a Yamamoto grub, a double tail grub, can get you through the entire fall and winter. It's really, really simple. Now, I mentioned budget. They're a fairly inexpensive jig. Now, as a result, you don't have a ton of options. Okay, they don't have a lot of colors. They have like 6 colors total, 8 colors, something like that. There's not a lot of them. That's a 5-inch Yamamoto double tail grub. There's a completed jig for you. If I could only have one size, it would be 1/2 ounce. But there's definitely a time and place to go heavier, to go to a 3/4 to keep good contact in deep water, or if you want to fish it more aggressively where you're popping and snapping that rod. Once the water gets really cold, you don't want to do that. But in the fall, like right now where we're just really getting into the heart of fall, you can still be really aggressive with a jig. You can really hop that thing and get those fish to react. So when that water temp gets really cold, that you'll just be dragging. Literally just drag, reel up the slack. Drag, reel up the slack. That's all there is to it. But that is a great, great jig. Now, next up, my favorite jig is the Dirty Jigs Finesse Football. And you guys know that this is my favorite jig. I could have gone without saying it. You already would have known. Again, 1/2 ounce is my favorite. There's a time and a place for a 3/4. There's a time and a place to drop back to like a 3/8. Because as you go to the lighter jigs, the overall profile's getting smaller, particularly with Bass Patrol. The whole jig gets a lot smaller when you go to the smaller head sizes. So if your fish are finicky, you can downsize really easily. But again, the dirty, the color schemes are just unbelievable. It's a full silicone skirt. And again, just like with the pitch and jig, I have two favorite colors. This time of year, it's Go-To, which is this, and it's Super Matte Brown, which is this. Now notice the difference here. These are both 1/2 ounce jigs, I think. Nope, I lied. This is a 3/8, this is a 1/2. But the overall skirt was the exact same. This one is completely stock. See how all the strands hang straight down? This is one that I modified. I thinned it and I shortened it, and as a result, it puffs up a lot more. Exact same jig, completely different profile. Sometimes I leave them totally stock. I like that larger profile. I put a 5-inch Yamamoto double tail in there. Sometimes I want to tighten it up, so I thin that skirt, I cut it shorter, and I go to a 4-inch double tail. It seems like nothing, right? A 4-inch versus a 5-inch. It's a huge difference because I've got mosquitoes all over me. We might shorten up this video today so I don't get completely bled out here. The 4-inch is way thinner all the way around. The legs are smaller, the body's thinner, the whole thing is totally different. Now the way we use these double tail grubs is you just thread them on. So there's a 4-inch on a thinned out jig, and there's the 5-inch on a full profile jig. They're very, very different sizes. If the bite's better, I'm getting a lot of bites, I'm throwing full skirt, 5-inch every single time. If it's a little tougher, I'm not getting as many bites as I thought I was going to get, or it's really critical, I'm in a tournament, I'm down to the wire, I need a bite, drop down, thin your skirt, put a 4-inch in there, you'll be way better off. And again, I keep colors really simple. These are my two colors. And I'll link everything in the video description, just like every other video. One more for you. This little guy is key. Now, actually, before I get to him, trailers. My main trailer is that Yamamoto double tail grub on a football jig. I mean, if I could only have one, that's it. If I could only have 5, that's still it. But if I went deeper than that, then these guys come into play. Netbait Pack-A-Chunk, Strike King Rage Chunk. Both of these are aggressive trailers. They kick, they have a lot of movement. The arms really flail in the water. The double tail grubs will also have movement, but it's just like this little, the tails are just kind of spinning back there behind the jig. Both of these are big and exaggerated. They kick, they move a lot of water. If I'm in a reservoir environment, double tail grub every single time, especially once the water gets colder. But if I'm in a river or a stream, say I'm chasing smallmouth, I'm fishing out of the kayak, sometimes, especially in current, more movement is good movement to help attract those fish. That's when I switch over and I throw those more aggressive trailers. Particularly the net bait, it comes in a couple of sizes, so you can really pair it up to your different jigs. Okay, back to the jigs. Last but not least is this little tiny Kitech jig. When I can't get bit, when it is a flat out tough bite, this is where I end up. Okay, and I pair it with either, they're both Z-Man, they're both Elastec stretchy baits, but either the little craw or the little bug. Let me pull one of these out. You guys might remember this from our underwater footage in the spring. We had a bass maul an orange jig, a jig that was this color, set up with one of these little guys on the back of it. That's that Z-Man craw. But this little profile, there's a couple of advantages here. And one of them is something I should have talked about with all the jigs, and I didn't. With all three, whether it's this little Kitech, where it's the most prevalent, or it's that Dirty Jigs Finesse, you have to really force this up there to get it in place. But once it's in place, it's done. Look at that tiny little crawdad profile. It's unbelievable. When they won't eat anything else, this is amazing. So circling back, there is literally a mosquito on the lens of the camera. All right, we got rid of him. It's infested right here. I need to get out of here. This little tiny guy will get bit with nothing else. And what I was about to say before we got interrupted is that these jigs, whether it's this little guy, whether it's a Bass Patrol, whether it's the Dirty Jigs Finesse Football, they're all lighter wire hook. That's critical in the fall. At the start of fall, not as important. Later in fall, it's everything, because that lighter hook means that you can throw lighter line. You can use a lighter rod, you can use lighter line, and you can still get a really, really powerful hook set. As the water gets colder, the bass chill out. They don't pull as hard as they did in the summertime. You can catch the same bass on lighter line. So when the going gets tough, and I'm throwing that football jig, in the summertime, when I was throwing that pitching jig, I was using, 15, 18, 20, 25 pound line, depending on how big I thought those fish were gonna be. By the time I get down to that finesse football in the fall, I'm throwing 10 or 12 pound line on my bait caster. Now I'm throwing braid to leader, so that's 10 to 12 pound leader. If you go all the way down to that Kitech jig, I mean, you can set that hook on 6 and 8 pound line. It's awesome, which means you are getting more bites. More fish will fall for your presentation. You'll get a hook in them, and then you get a shot at landing that giant fish. So this time of year, these finesse jigs, these finesse hooks are the deal. How far down the rabbit hole you want to go? If you want to go all the way down to a Kitech tungsten jig with a little micro hook, or if you're just trying to get an overall smaller profile, or if you're trying to do it on a budget, there's something for you. You can keep it really simple. You just need a couple of colors. Super Matte Brown, my favorite color, is essentially a cinnamon purple jig. It's got some green pumpkin. It's got some different things that really make it a deep color. Go-to is essentially green pumpkin brown. Okay, when you get over to Bass Patrol, they've got some really similar colors. When you go Kitech, they've got some really similar colors, purple and brown. Keep it simple. If you want to mix up color, mix it up with your trailer. See, this is a brown and purple jig with a green pumpkin trailer, and it looks great. This is a brown and orange jig with a cinnamon purple trailer, and it looks great. So if you're going to play with color, keep the jigs simple. You don't need very many jigs. The trailers are cheap. Get yourself a few different colors of trailers, and then you can mix and match, and you can really adapt to changing conditions. As far as gear goes, with a jig, I'm different than a lot of people in this industry. I like a jig rod, most of you know this, with a very soft tip section. Very soft. But then I want a lot of backbone in the middle of the rod. Jigs tend to have a bigger hook, although not these finesse jigs. So most people want a pretty stout rod so they can really set. I really like that soft tip. One, I like it when I'm dragging, because when I'm dragging a jig and I'm pulling it across the bottom, the rod tip will deflect. It'll bend a little bit. That's just the weight of the jig as I'm pulling it. In the dead of winter, because this rod, it's not like you're only going to use it in the fall. In the dead of winter, when the water's super cold and I'm just slow pulling that jig, a lot of times you don't feel a thump. You don't feel them eat it. All that'll happen is as I'm dragging that jig, they come up and latch onto it, and it'll just bend a little bit more. And because that rod tip is so soft, I see the difference. I don't even feel it per se. I see the difference, and I get those fish. So if you know how to do that, if you know how to watch for deflection in a rod tip, you can even throw a jig on a really budget rod that's not particularly sensitive. As long as it's a longer rod with a softer tip, you can just watch for deflection in the rod and you'll stick those fish. The second reason is that when bass come up and they're trying to shake a jig, when they come up and jump and they're trying to spit it, A 1/2 ounce jig, I mean, that's a lot of weight, especially when you add in the weight of the trailer, the weight of the skirt. The whole package is pretty heavy. When a fish comes up to thrash that, if that rod is too stiff, again, a lot of people like a stiff rod, that thing will just load and unload as that fish is shaking, and they'll sling that jig. A softer rod like this that'll load down through the rod, when you get bowed up on them and they come up to jump, no matter how hard they shake their head, that rod will be unloading, but it will never fully unload. It'll never go back to straight where they can spit it. So you will land a lot more of your fish if you use the right rod. This is a G Loomis. It's a GLX, the MBR series, MBR. I use the 3 power and the 4 power. Again, I'll link it down in the video description. They have it in the GLX, they have it down into the IMX Pro, and they have it up into the Conquest. But there are some other great jig rods. There are great budget rods. I'll link all that for you. Again, quick recap. If you've still got a ton of grass, keep the colors the same, but use a pitching head. It'll come through the grass easier. It'll save you a lot of headaches. If you don't, if your fish are already moving to hard structure, if you're on a budget, throw a Bass Patrol, you'll do great. If you're not, switch to either the dirty, the finesse football, because you get amazing color options, amazing consistency, phenomenal hook, super sharp hook. It's just consistent. Or go to Kitech. Kitech, you're talking about a tungsten jig. Obviously, you're going to pay for tungsten. That's just the way it works. So 3 really good options, different sizes, different profiles, but all will work in that cooling and ultimately cold water. Now again, as far as where you throw that jig, you're looking for that hard structure. As we get into fall, hop it, throw it up there, let it hit bottom, pull it a little, give it a couple of good hops, hop it up, and then take off, let it fall. Hop, hop, let it fall. Hop, hop, let it fall. A lot of times when that's your technique, when they eat it, it's a thump. They really hit it hard. If you're fishing it slower, sometimes they tick it, sometimes they hit it hard. Sometimes your rod just gets heavy. It feels like you're up against the snag, but it's not a snag, it's a fish. So set that hook. As you get farther into winter, slow that presentation down. Go to lighter line, softer hooks, slow pull that jig. And it's really important that Yamamoto double tail, and I keep saying Yamamoto, especially in the first part of fall, you can throw any double tail. We throw that big bite a lot because they have that tilapia color that I like so much. I love that thing. But it's made of a slightly stiffer plastic. So when the water gets really cold, come December, January, I switch over to that Yamamoto because it's made of a softer plastic. Simple colors, but they work, but it will continue to move even when that water temp dips down into like the high 30s. It will continue to have just enough movement. Those fish will still eat it. Stiffer plastics, like that big bite, or say the Strike King, that net bait, all of these baits, as that water gets colder, they change. They'll actually stop kicking. They get stiff in the water. The different plastics work differently. But I keep saying Yamamoto because as we get to the end of fall, going into that cold, cold water, you really want to pair either that 4-inch or that 5-inch for that slow dragging technique, just to be more consistent. Guys, I hope this helps you. Again, I'll link it because I know I cover a lot and I bounce around, but I'll make it as simple as I can in the description so you can follow along. It's just a couple of baits. Get a dedicated rod. Take your time. Spend time throwing that jig when you would otherwise be throwing a shaky head, a drop shot, all sorts of different things. Try a jig, even if it's a little tiny one, and you'll be surprised that when you come across the big ones, they eat it. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.